For the 400 years prior to World War I, there was no confusion concerning who the sovereign was in the Middle East. It was the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, however, the Ottoman Turks were defeated in World War I, and the empire collapsed. Their territories then became occupied by the Allied powers as the countries of the world came together to form the League of Nations. The purpose of the League of Nations was to figure out a solution for what to do with these vast portions of land which now had no coherent administration. The League of Nations was formed by an international treaty, which specifically imbued it with the authority to oversee the mandate system. This is the same mandate system, by the way, that was used to split up the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the various European nations. Its purpose was to functionally oversee the transition of these areas into independent countries. This mandate system, empowered by the League of Nations, was in turn authorized by the countries which agreed and delegated it that authority. So with regard to what was now the former Ottoman Empire, it was determined that the British and French would divide these areas and act as the trustees, until the populations were able to form functional systems of governance. A mandate for Palestine is created at this time, along with the British mandate for Mesopotamia, and a French mandate for Syria. Let's talk about this term Palestine for a second. Did you know that the very first time that the term Palestine was used was by the Greeks in the 2nd century? After they invaded the Kingdom of Judah and exiled the Jews, they maliciously renamed it Syria Palestina after the Jewish people's greatest enemy, because in Greek this means the homeland of the Philistines. Even at that time, though, this was a misnomer, since the Philistines had originated from the island of Crete, only occupied a small area approximately the size and location of Gaza, and had already ceased to exist centuries earlier. The legitimate name for what had been conquered was the Kingdom of Judah, and the Romans referred to it as the province of Judea. The ruler Hadrian then brought Greeks to settle it and forbade Jews to enter upon pain of death. Jerusalem was rebranded Aelia Capitolina, and the rest of the general area became Syria Palestina. However, the Romans continue calling it Judea, and over time the term Palestina becomes basically obsolete. In fact, throughout the entirety of the 400 years of Ottoman rule, there were no administrative or political entities called Palestine, and the name was never officially applied again until the British in 1920 revived it with the British Mandate for Palestine. There are very few absolutes when it comes to international law, but borders of mandated territory is one such absolute, and the mandated borders are all agreed upon at this point in 1920. Although many folks seem to believe that following the First World War the British had acquired the territories in the Middle East as colonies, and then post-World War II chose to donate it to the Jews, the reality is that Britain was merely entrusted with the temporary administration of these territories in order to help the indigenous people create their own nation-states. The League of Nations mandate, therefore, is the instrument which establishes Israel's modern title to the territory, similarly to every other modern country formed from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. The text of Article 22 of the League of Nations Treaty clearly explains its intention. Article 22 reads,
To those colonies and territories which as a consequence of the late war have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly govern them and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples from a sacred trust of civilization and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations, who by reason of their resources, their experience or their geographical position can best undertake this responsibility and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League. The character of the mandate must differ according to the stage of the development of the people, the geographical situation of the territory, its economic conditions, and other similar circumstances. Certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand alone. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. Other peoples peoples, especially those of Central Africa, are at such a stage that the mandatory must be responsible for the administration of the territory under conditions which will guarantee freedom of conscience and religion, subject only to the maintenance of public order and morals, the prohibition of abuses such as the slave trade, the arms traffic and the liquor traffic, and the prevention of the establishment of fortifications of military and naval bases and of military training of the natives for other than police purposes and the defense of territory, and will also secure equal opportunities for the trade and commerce of other members of the League. There are territories such as Southwest Africa and certain of the South Pacific Islands, which, owing to the sparseness of their population, or their small size, or their remoteness from the centers of civilization, or their geographical contiguity to the territory of the mandatory, and other circumstances, can be best administered under the laws of the mandatory as integral portions of its territory, subject to the safeguards above mentioned in the interests of the indigenous population. In every case of mandate, the mandatory shall render to the Council an annual report in reference to the territory committed to its charge. The degree of authority, control, or administration to be exercised by the mandatory shall, if not previously agreed upon by the members of the League, be explicitly defined in each case by the Council. A permanent commission shall be constituted to receive and examine the annual reports of the mandatories and to advise the Council on all matters relating to the observance of the mandates.
There were more than 20 mandates besides the Mandate for Palestine, which collectively formed basically all of the modern countries and borders in the Middle East. Class A mandates were legally viewed as temporary entities, and all Middle East mandates were Class A. So although it's usually understood that Israel wasn't declared a nation until 1948, the truth is that it was considered an independent Class A mandate from 1920 until 1948 under international law. As evidence of this, here is a page out of the Larousse French Dictionary in 1939. In its appendix, it records all of the then-current flags of the world in alphabetical order. Notice that the German flag pictured was the Nazi swastika, which demonstrates that this is pre-1945. As you zoom in, you'll see that there is a flag for Palestine. What does it look like? Are you surprised? But wasn't Palestine an Islamic, Arab, Turkish, Circassian sovereign state that the evil Jews took over in 1948? No. The British, as legal mandatory over the mandate, managed, or perhaps mismanaged, the state, partially with Jewish auxiliary, until Jews regained official sovereignty in 1948 by declaring their independence. The UN did not simply create Israel, as some people claim. Most people are aware of the fact that there are records of Palestinians in Palestine prior to Israel becoming an independent, internationally recognized nation, but many of these people fail to ask to whom that term was referring. Let's suppose it was the native indigenous Arab Muslim population that the Zionists kicked out when they colonized Israel. How can we find out? Well, one way would be to examine records and evidence from that period of time. When we do, we become aware that if, as an example, Palestinians were mentioned in an article in the international press, it typically referred to Jews the vast majority of the time. Before 1948, and really it's closer to pre-1967, when Palestinians were mentioned, it most often referred to Jews, not Arabs. Arabs would not have named themselves Palestinians, since Arabic doesn't contain the letter P in its alphabet. The very first time that these Arabs were ever called Palestinians was not until years after Israeli independence. Why is this significant? Well, as a result of anti-Semitic propaganda, many folks these days seem to be confused about Jewish rights to the territory. The Arabs who have so recently called themselves Palestinians are not, as many assume, an indigenous population who had been living there since time immemorial. They are not the natives whose territory was stolen or colonized by the Jews. This really is nothing more than an outright lie. From the beginning of known history to this day, Israel, Judah, Judea has the only still remaining united independent sovereign nation state that ever existed in the area which has come to be known as Palestine, west of the Jordan River. This is the Arco de Tito, or Arch of Titus. It was built in the 1st century, and it is irrefutable proof of the Jewish history in ancient Palestine. In those times, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, as well as Israel, had land east of the Jordan. However, these nations disappeared in antiquity, and no other nations ever took their place until Transjordan was invented by the British in the 1920s. After the Roman conquest of Judea, as depicted on the Arco de Tito, Palestina became a province of the pagan Roman Empire, and then of the Christian Byzantine Empire, and very briefly of the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. In 638 CE, an Arab Muslim caliph took Palestina away from the Byzantine Empire and made it part of an Arab Muslim empire. The Arabs, who had no name of their own for this region, adopted the Greco-Roman name Palestina that they pronounced Falestine. In that period, much of the mixed population of Palestina converted to Islam and adopted the Arabic language. They were subjects to a distant caliph who ruled them from his capital that was first in Damascus and later in Baghdad. They did not become a nation or an independent state or develop a distinct society or culture. In 1099, Christian crusaders from Europe conquered Palestine. After 1099, it was never again under Arab rule. The Christian Crusader kingdom was politically independent, but never developed a national identity. It remained a military outpost of Christian Europe and lasted less than 200 years. After that, Palestine was joined to Syria as a subject province, first of the Mamelukes, ethnically mixed slave warriors whose center was in Egypt, and then of the Ottoman Turks, whose capital was in Istanbul, also known as Constantinople. 400 years later, during the First World War, the British took Palestine from the Ottoman Turks. At the end of that war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Among its subject provinces, Palestine was assigned to the British to govern temporarily as a mandate for the League of Nations. This brings us all the way up to 1920 with no question of who is the sovereign. But what is the population like at this point? The historical facts are quite different from what the Arab narrative, which has been adopted by many in academic and intellectual circles, presents. In 1857, the British consul to Palestine reported, quote,
"The country is in a considerable degree empty of inhabitants, and therefore its greatest need is that of a body of population."
End quote. A British research mission prepared a little-known census by conducting a survey of the land of Israel during the period of 1871 to 1878. Based on this map, whose original size is that of a large room, it can be determined which settlements existed in those years and their size. According to these details, it is possible to estimate the size of the population there. In 1695, the author Hadriani Rolandi was sent on a sightseeing tour to Israel, at that time known unofficially as Palestina. In his travels, he surveyed approximately 2,500 locations where people lived that were mentioned in the Bible or Mishnah. He first mapped the land of Israel. Then he identified each of the places mentioned in the Mishnah or Talmud along with their original source. If the source was Jewish, he listed it together with the appropriate sentence in the Holy Scriptures. If the source was Roman or Greek, he presented the connection in Greek or Latin. Thirdly, he also arranged a population survey and census of each community. Here are his most prominent conclusions. 1. Not one settlement in the land of Israel has a name that is of Arabic origin. Most of the settlement names originate in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Roman languages. In fact, until today, except for Ramallah, not one Arabic settlement has an original Arabic name. 2. Most of the land was empty, desolate, and the inhabitants few in number, and mostly concentrated in the towns Jerusalem, Akko, Sfat, Jaffa, Tiberias, and Gaza. Most of the inhabitants were Jews and the rest Christians. There were few Muslims, mostly nomadic Bedouins. Rolandi mentioned the Muslims as nomad Bedouins who arrived in the area as construction and agriculture labor reinforcements, also known as seasonal workers. 3. No Palestinian heritage or Palestinian nation. The book totally contradicts any postmodern theory claiming a Palestinian heritage or Palestinian nation. At the same time, the historical book strengthens the connection, relevance, pertinence, and kinship of the land of Israel to the Jews, and the absolute lack of belonging to the Arabs. The records of quoted accounts of the time also support this. Chapter 9, paragraph 43 for the 1937 report of the Palestine Royal Commission states, quote,
"The road leading from Gaza to the north was only a summer track suitable for transport by camels and carts. No orange groves, orchards, or vineyards were to be seen until one reached Yabna village. Not in a single village in all this area was water used for irrigation. Houses were all of mud, no windows were anywhere to be seen. The ploughs used were of wood, the yields were very poor, the sanitary conditions in the village were horrible. Schools did not exist, the rate of infant mortality was very high. The area north of Jaffa consisted of two distinctive parts. The eastern part, in the direction of the hills, resembled in culture that of Gaza-Jaffa area. The western part towards the sea was almost a desert. The villages in this area were few and thinly populated. Many ruins of villages were scattered over the area, as owing to the prevalence of malaria, many villages were deserted by their inhabitants.
End quote. In 1931, a quote from the report of Mr. Louis French, the Director of Development appointed by the British government, states, quote,
"We found it inhabited by fellahin who lived in mud hovels and suffered severely from the prevalent malaria. Large areas of their lands were uncultivated and covered with weeds. There were no trees, no vegetables. The fellahin, if not themselves cattle thieves, were always ready to harbour these and other criminals. The individual plots of cultivation changed hands annually. There was little public security, and the fellahin's lot was an alternation of pillage and blackmail by their neighbours the Bedouin."
End quote. This was the condition of Palestine in the final decades of the 19th century, up until the First World War. A land that was overwhelmingly desert, with nomads continually encroaching on the settled areas and its farmers, a deficiency of basic facilities and equipment, peasants wallowing in poverty, ignorance, and disease, saddled with debt and threatened by warlike nomads or neighboring clans. The result had been an increasing neglect of the soil and a flight out of the villages, with a growing concentration of large tracts of property under the control of a small number of absentee landowners who were most often residing in such remote Arab capitals as Beirut and Damascus, Cairo, and Kuwait. Additionally, travelers to Palestine from the Western world did leave records of what they saw there. The motif throughout their accounts is dismal. The land was empty, neglected, abandoned, desolate, fallen into ruin. An English pilgrim in 1590 explained, quote,
"Nothing there to be seen but a little of the old walls which is yet remaining, and all the rest is grass, moss, and weeds."
End quote. In 1867, the president of Harvard University, Charles Willis Eliot, stated, quote,
"A beautiful sea lies unbosomed among the Galilean hills, in the midst of that land once possessed by Zebulun and Naphtali, Asher and Dan. Life here was once idyllic, now it is the scene of desolation and misery."
End quote. Also in 1867, upon traveling there, Mark Twain had this to say, quote,
"There is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent, not for 30 miles in either direction. One may ride 10 miles hereabouts and not see 10 human beings. For the sort of solitude to make one dreary, come to Galilee. Nazareth is forlorn, Jericho lies in a mouldering ruin, Bethlehem and Bethany in their poverty and humiliation, untenanted by any living creature. A desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse, a desolation. We never saw a human being on the whole route, hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Even the olive tree and the cactus, the fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes, desolate and unlovely."
End quote. The restoration of this desolate and unlovely land commenced in the latter half of the 19th century with the early Jewish pioneers. Their labor generated better and newer conditions and opportunities, which in turn attracted migrants from numerous regions of the Middle East, both Arabs and others. In his book, Those Holy Fields, Reverend Samuel Manning in 1874 stated, quote,
"But where were the inhabitants? The fertile plain, which might support an immense population, is almost a solitude."
End quote. Throughout the period of the Mandate, it had been the Jewish population whom were known as Palestinian, including those that served in the British Army in World War II. Nevertheless, British policy was to curtail their numbers, and they progressively restricted Jewish immigration. So by 1939, the White Paper had all but ended the immigration of Jews into Palestine. This plan was imposed the most stringently at the very time that this home was most desperately needed, after the rise of Nazis in Europe. Jews who might have developed the vacant land of Palestine and left progeny there, instead died in the gas chambers of Europe, or at sea as they were attempting to cross into the Promised Land. At the same time that the British slammed the gates closed on the Jews, they permitted or ignored massive illegal immigration into Western Palestine from Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Precise population statistics may be problematic. However, it appears that by 1947, the number of Arabs west of the Jordan River was roughly triple what it had been in 1900. The Arabs had been drawn by new employment opportunities provided by the Jewish pioneers, and a massive Arab immigration began. The governor of the Syrian district of Haran, Tufik Bey al-Harani, admitted in 1934 that in a single period of just a few months, more than 30,000 Syrians from Haran had moved to Palestine. On May 17, 1939, FDR stated, quote,
"The Arab immigration to Palestine since 1921 was much greater than Jewish immigration."
End quote. The British Hope Simpson Commission recommended in 1930, quote,
"Prevention of illicit immigration,"
end quote, to stop the illegal Arab immigration. In 1939, Winston Churchill noted the Arab invasion, quote,
"The Arabs have crowded into the country and multiplied till their population has increased more than even all the world Jewry could lift up the Jewish population."
End quote. It is significant to mention that the first enduring Jewish agricultural settlement in modern Palestine was founded not by European refugees, but by a group of old-time families departing the overcrowded Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. According to the Turkish census of 1875, by that time Jews already constituted a majority of the populace of Jerusalem, and by 1905 comprised 2/3 of its citizens. The Encyclopedia Britannica of 1910 gives the population figure as 60,000, of whom 40,000 were Jews. The Jewish National Fund was created on December 25, 1901, to ensure the property would be purchased on behalf of the Jewish workers who were to be held personally responsible for its cultivation. The assets of the Jewish National Fund were mainly raised from small regular donations from millions of Jewish craftsmen, laborers, shop owners, and intellectuals in Central and Eastern Europe, where the shadow of genocide was already apparent and who felt concerned about the return of Jews to Zion. Altogether, hundreds of millions of dollars were paid out by Jewish buyers to Arab landowners. Official documents reveal that in 1933, £854,796 was paid by Jewish individuals and organizations for Arab land, primarily large estates. In 1934, the figure was £1,647,836, and in 1935, £1,699,488. So in the course of only 3 years, £4,202,180, more than $350 million in today's currency, was paid out to Arab landowners according to the Palestine Royal Commission report of 1937. The effects on the Arab population were that in those instances where, as a result of such transactions, Arab tenant farmers were displaced on 1 year's notice, compensation in cash or other land was paid as required by the 1922 Protection of Cultivators Ordinance, and the Jewish land buying associations often paid more than the law required. The evidence and records of the time all corroborate the fact that most of today's quote-unquote Palestinian refugees were nothing more than Arabs who migrated from Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Algeria, and Libya toward the beginning of the 20th century. This myth that there had been a stable, situated Palestinian Arab Muslim populace that had lived in villages and harvested the land for centuries, only to be expelled by the Zionist invaders, is simply inconsistent with all the documented demographic statistics accumulated not by the Jews or Zionists, but rather by the regional officials themselves. This is further proven by the fact that according to the UNRWA, who altered the long-standing definition of refugee at this time, from that of someone who had fled a permanent home to the new definition, a quote-unquote Palestinian refugee had only to have lived there for 2 years prior to Israeli statehood. It is also noteworthy that during the same period of time, 100,000 square kilometers of Jewish-owned land, which is equivalent to 4 times the size of Israel, was either seized or abandoned in Arab lands. This amounts to approximately 850,000 Jewish refugees who were indeed ethnically cleansed from Arab countries. The number of Jews in the Arab world in 1948 was 878,000. Today, the Jews remaining in Arab countries totals less than 8,000. So, just as a tool to establish a baseline here, in 1948, just prior to Israel's declaration of independence, there was no dispute as to the borders of Palestine-Israel. The final determination by the League of Nations as of September 16, 1922, is that the boundaries of Jewish Palestine are the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. If you were to ask anyone at the time what the borders were, they would say everything between the river and the sea. In the meantime, World War II begins, and between 1939 and 1942, 6 million Jews are killed by the Germans. Afterward, no countries are willing to accept the refugees. 1945, the Mandate System creates Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Libya, Algeria, Jordan, Morocco, Sudan, and others. The UN takes over for the League of Nations, and the Mandate System becomes the trustee system. The final decisions were made at San Remo, and the San Remo Resolution, which was signed by 51 countries, gives Jews the rights to Palestine and rights to the rest of the Middle East to the Arabs. The Arabs, however, are not willing to accept any division of the Middle East, and they respond with violence and acts of terror against Jewish civilians. A simple search through newspaper archives of the time proves beyond any doubt that this is true. As a response to this violence, in order to avoid civil war, the UN does get involved in an attempt to broker peace, and they do this through the General Assembly Partition Proposal in 1947, where they proposed 6 different sections, of which the Jews and Arabs each got 3. If both sides had accepted the proposal, then it would have become binding international law. The Jews accepted, but the Arabs rejected. They stated an unwillingness to accept any form of territorial division. So, because both parties did not accept the proposal, it was not implemented, and the borders revert to the prior agreement. May 14, 1948, the British Mandate expires, and Israel declares independence. The celebration was short-lived, however, because immediately on the day Israel regained sovereignty in 1948, the armies of 5 Arab states formed a coalition and attacked. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invade, and Israel pushes their armies back to the armistice line. Here's where the confusion over the borders begins. The armistice demarcation line is also known as the Green Line or the 1967 borders. However, these quote-unquote borders were not created in 1967, they were established in 1949, and they're not borders. The armistice demarcation line is simply the line where the fighting stopped. It does not reflect any pre-existing political, administrative, territorial, demographic, topographic, or ethno-linguistic borders, and the instrument which creates the Green Line states explicitly that it isn't a border. Quote,
Armistice demarcation line is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary.
End quote. It is merely the furthest extent of Jordanian and Egyptian aggression in 1949. It's a product of illegal Arab aggression against the newly reconstituted State of Israel with the goal of preventing its existence. Therefore, to make the 1949 armistice line into the new borders is to retroactively vindicate, legitimize, and reward the Arab conquest attempt of 1949. Signed April 3, 1949, Article 2 of the General Armistice Agreement between Israel and Jordan states that there is, quote,
no provision which prejudices the rights, claims, or positions of either party.
End quote. We often hear the word occupation referring to Israel. What occupation means in international law is when a sovereign inhabits an area that belongs to another sovereign. So, as has been demonstrated here, these two areas belong to Israel, and after Israel survived the invasion, the West Bank was occupied by Jordan, and Egypt occupied Gaza. Here is a viral meme that we see quite often, allegedly describing the Palestinian land loss. However, it is complete fiction. Firstly, in 1947, Palestine belongs to the Jews, as we've seen from the verifiable historical evidence and data. Secondly, this partition plan was not accepted by the Arabs. If it had been, then that would have been an independent Palestinian nation. But it was rejected and therefore it has no legal standing. In the third frame you see, these areas were governed by Jordan and Egypt, not Palestine, which did not yet exist as a national identity and which has never existed as a legal one. And in the last frame, in a complete irony, the green areas represent the first time in history that these Arabs who have only recently come to be known as Palestinians govern themselves, and it was given to them by Israel. So here you can see a much more accurate depiction of the loss of land, and it's not Palestinian Arab land that was lost, it was Jewish land. However, the State of Israel has a long tradition, and more importantly a record, of giving away land for the promise of peace. We see this play out after the next war, which was the Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel gains the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Gaza. Each of these situations is different. The Sinai Peninsula belongs to the sovereign Egypt. The Golan Heights belonged to the sovereign Syria. But the West Bank and Gaza, Israel is the successor state to the League of Nations mandate, and Israel has the superior claim of title in comparison to Jordan and Egypt, the only other possible sovereigns in the area. So the Six-Day War did not change the borders. What happened in the West Bank and Gaza is that Israelis regained their own land that had previously been illegally occupied by Jordan and Egypt. And you can see that this is true because in its 1964 charter, the PLO, an organization which purports to be the exclusive representation for the Palestinian people, states under Article 24 that it, quote,
does not exercise any territorial sovereignty over the West Bank in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, on the Gaza Strip, or in the Himar area.
End quote. Of course, they subsequently rewrote their charter in 1968 after they lost the Six-Day War, and then, all of a sudden, at that point, it did include those areas. So why is it that during the 19 years between Israel declaring its independence and Israel regaining their own land in another defensive war against Arab aggression, while Jordan and Egypt occupy these areas, no one sees fit even to mention, let alone demand, that Palestinian Arabs be given the status of statehood? Perhaps these statements can shed some light on the matter. In an interview with the Dutch magazine Trouw, the chief of military operations of the PLO, Zahir Mohsen, says, quote,
yes, the existence of a separate Palestinian identity exists only for tactical reasons.
End quote. And in 1946, Philip Heaty, an Arab historian, testified before the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry stating, quote,
there's no such thing as Palestine in history, absolutely not.
End quote. The term Palestine was a Roman attempt following the 135 CE Jewish rebellion to eradicate Jews and Judaism from human memory. The Latin term, on the advice of the Soviet KGB, was later misappropriated by the Arabs as if it were their own, for the specific purpose of confusing those who don't know any better into thinking that they were the indigenous population. In 1937, the British government sent a team to investigate the Arab revolt, which was led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem and the father of the Palestinian movement. Headed by Lord Peel, the commission was to establish what was happening and why. Husseini was called as a witness to testify, and when asked by Sir Laurie Hammond whether the problem was that the Jews had taken Arab lands by force, he responded, in most cases, the lands were acquired. Sir Hammond responds, I mean forcibly acquired, compulsory acquisition as land would be acquired for public purposes? No, it wasn't. Not taken by compulsory acquisition? No. But these lands, amounting to some 700,000 dunams, were actually sold? Yes, they were sold, but the country was placed in such conditions as would facilitate such purchases. I don't quite understand what you mean by that. They were sold? Who sold them? Landowners. Arabs? In most cases, they were Arabs. Was any compulsion put on them to sell? If so, by whom? As in other countries, there are people who, by force of circumstances, economic forces, sell their land. Only, these are the guys who sold it, the Effendi, the great feudal lords of the area. Furthermore, not only did the Jewish Zionists not steal land from the largely non-existent permanent population of Arabs, they actually paid the Arab owners of that land much more than it was worth at the time for it. So, knowing all of that, you might now be asking yourself, if that's all true, then what is all the conflict about? And that is an excellent question. Fortunately, it's one that the Palestinians have answered in their own words. Here is the charter for Hamas, who is the elected governing body in Gaza. Just to be clear, these are not my words. These are not subjective. These are the words of the leadership of Palestinians in Gaza. These are the words of those who would be considered the government if they were sovereign.
Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it just as it obliterated others before it.
Now, we're not going to read the whole thing. There are many passages that could be read, and a few have been highlighted, but you are strongly encouraged to either pause the recording and read the entire document here, or download and print it, or what have you, and read the whole text. In their own words, they describe what this document is. Quote,
this covenant of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, clarifies its pictures, reveals its identity, outlines its stand, explains its aims, speaks about its hopes, and calls for its support, adoption, and joining its ranks. Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. It's a step that inevitably should be followed by other steps. The movement is but one squadron that should be supported by more and more squadrons from this vast Arab and Islamic world until the enemy is vanquished and Allah's victory is realized.
End quote. In the section called Definition of the Movement and Ideological Starting Points, it discusses how they are a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been known for decades as a terrorist organization internationally. It talks about raising the banner of jihad in the face of the oppressors, which, by the way, is not only Jews and Israel. It strives to, quote,
raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine.
End quote. Which means that Israel would not exist. It does not mean peace side by side with Israelis. Here's another quote from the document. Quote,
the day of judgments will not come about until the Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews.
End quote. This continues in the same manner for the remaining 15 pages. And for the sake of comparison, here is the Declaration of Independence of Israel so that you can see the difference. These documents represent the stated intentions in the words of each party. As you can see, they are drastically different in tone and general outlook. And this very much speaks to the truth about who wants peace and who really doesn't. The founding document reveals in no uncertain terms that the Jewish state of Israel is a democratic nation that guarantees equal rights to all of its citizens regardless of race, religion, gender, etc. And you will see that in stark contrast, the Hamas Charter is essentially 15 pages of Jew hatred, which discusses killing Jews and obliterating Israel, pushing it into the sea. Much of it is propaganda, some of which is wildly outlandish, and it shows us why there's conflict. There's conflict because the Arabs do not want Israel to exist and will not stop until they get rid of all the Jews and obliterate Israel. That's again not an opinion, it's not a subjective conclusion, it's their own words and precisely what their stated intention is. This is consistently reaffirmed by their leadership and by the manner in which they're indoctrinating their children to continue to hate Jews and want to kill them. The following video shows what airs on Palestinian television. Please take note of the dates these programs aired, as some are quite recent.
أؤكد لكم يا فخامة الرئيس أننا نربي أطفالنا وأحفادنا وأولادنا على ثقافة السلام.
I heard President Abbas yesterday say that Palestinians teach their children peace. That's unfortunately not true.
حجري صار كلاشنكوف. لماذا ذبحناهم في شوارع بيروت؟ لأجلك يا أبو عمار، لعيونك احنا نموت، بكرة نجيب الثار قائدهم بتابوت. احنا الفتح إعصار للثورة دم ناقوت.
نحارب اليهود ونقتلهم ونقدر عليهم.
إلى حرب تدق الظلمة تزهق روح صهيوني.
إلى حرب تدق الظلمة تزهق روح صهيوني.
إلى حرب تدق الظلمة تزهق روح صهيوني. إلى حرب تدق الظلمة تزهق روح صهيوني.
إلى حرب تدق الظلمة تزهق روح صهيوني.
برافو.
شيل سلاحك قاوم وانهب، دمر زلزل احرق واشعل.
يا بني صهيونة يا شر البرية، يا قرودا همجية، يا خنازيرا شقية.
يا بني صهيون يا سر البرية، يا قرود همجية،
قرودا همجية، يا خنازير شقية.
أعداء الله أبناء الخنازير تصب النساء في الميادين، وأين أمة الإسلام والمجاهدين؟ برافو زقفي.
قد بنيت خطتي على نار الحقد والكراهية التي تملأ قلوب اليهود نحو محمد وأتباعه.
أن عدونا صهيون شيطان له ذيل، وأن عدونا صهيون شيطان له ذيل،
وأن عدونا صهيون شيطان له ذيل،
وعدونا صهيون شيطان له ذيل.
شكرا كثير لك يارا، أنا بحبها هاي كثير القصيدة.
إحنا بدنا نقول إنه فلسطين موجودة وفلسطين رح ترجع وما في إشي اسمه إسرائيل.
برافو عليك.
This will conclude part 1 of Verifiable History Presents directly from the source. Thank you for taking the time to educate yourself on this topic because, just like with any problem, it cannot be resolved without addressing the actual cause, and the real cause cannot be determined without accurate information. All the people in this region, Jews, Christians, Arabs, Muslims, and everyone else alike, deserve peace. However, peace will continue to elude us until we have a proper diagnosis, which allows us to treat the root of the problem. This requires correcting false narratives and educating ourselves about the verifiable historical facts. Please do share this video with anyone who may not be aware of the information presented, as this is one step you can take to help the peace process.